All right, well, good morning. A little different than being up here talking about church finances or so, but we'll give it a shot or so. Today for me, talking about faith story is I really would like to talk about some times in my life where what seemed like normal times I just had to make a decision. There was an opportunity out there. I had to decide, well, what was I going to do, answer a call. And these are times where, in looking back, I probably would not have said I really felt God or the Spirit present and leading me in a lot of these cases. But as I look back on them now and look with different eyes, and I realize how much, faith has entered into some of these decisions, how it's affected my life, how these things have gone on. So we'll give you a little history, talk about some events, and then hopefully kind of create a theme around that at the end. So I grew up in New York City in Queens. I'm not a native Midwesterner, although I don't talk like that anymore. But I can occasionally bring it on. We went to a really small Lutheran church. That's almost redundant in New York to say small Lutheran church. The early service was actually in German at that point in time, which may be one of the reasons I've tended to gravitate to later services over the years, since I knew no German. We were regular churchgoers. I mean, we went every week, but I don't know that I would have called our family overly religious, but we were very active in the church. And some of the things I remember early on in life, I had a couple of major life events when I was young. In fourth grade, my father passed away from cancer, and it was obviously a major situation at that point in time. He'd been hospitalized for a brief period of time, and my mom was able to kind of let us know he wasn't coming home from the time in Manhattan in the hospital. But, that was obviously a major situation in fourth grade with your dad dying. A year later, my mom's dad, my grandfather, who lived in the house with us, had been there the whole time, passed away also. So I had two kind of people who were in my life every day pass away early on. And I've got, memories of that. Lots of memories of funeral homes, cemeteries, doing all of the events with funerals. And I remember our pastor being there at all of those things. Probably the 23rd Psalm will always be etched in that point in time of my life, because having kind of heard it in those situations twice within a little over a year, that's we'll always associate there with that. It was also strange. My grandfather was a Mason, and so in the funeral home we had a religious service the one night, and then we had a kind of Masonic event, which while I knew that he had been involved with that, I'd never saw anything like that before, and that was just another part of that period of time when I look back on it and try to think, a lot of stuff happened there. At the time, I don't know that I thought of it as very religious or spiritual, but it was definitely, kind of a piece that helped shape my life and would lead to things in the future. But it was a couple of years later where I think the first time our faith life or my faith life or my church life wound up having some kind of impact in my life. My mom was the controller of the church then. There's probably some genetic trait involved here. She was the controller because at that point in time, as a woman, she couldn't be the treasurer of the church because only men could be on church council and be church officers. It was okay for her to do the books. It just wasn't okay for her to officially be in charge of them or so. But she had that role. She was, while not on church council, at church council all the time. And at that point in time in her life, she actually started dating the guy who was the treasurer at that point in time. They eventually got married, and I wound up with what I think of as my second dad at that point in time, because that was the summer, I think, before I started junior high school, so still pretty early in my life. But it was one of these first instances where some connection with our faith life, our church life, or some other things really started to take a shape and help me shape where my life was going to be. And it's a theme that will keep kind of coming up as life goes on, where where having a faith life has really led to kind of the future and impacted me. So before I started high school, we made the big move. If you lived in Queens and New York, we moved to New Jersey, which from here doesn't seem like quite a move, but if you're in New York City, it's a huge move. I would be safe to say that high school was probably not my most active faith period in my life. We had just moved to a new town. I started high school not knowing a single person there, which I wouldn't recommend. And we joined a church, but it was like 3 towns over. And other than playing in a basketball league there, that's pretty much about the only memorable church experience I can say from the high school years for doing that. But, so you make other choices. I was active in theater. I worked at the Burger King. I was in the AV club at high school. Actually was president of the AV club, a thing that my family has not shown adequate respect for over the years when we talk about it. But, but I really did lead me to sort of the next point in my life where I had to make a choice, and faith, in hindsight, probably played a part in that choice. So it was time to figure out where we're going to go to college. So New Jersey, not known for its higher education system. Everybody leaves the state and goes somewhere else. And so I was looking at high schools at that point in time, colleges, sorry. And the top choice for me was William and Mary. I don't know if you've ever been to Williamsburg, Virginia, but it's a historical town. William and Mary is the second oldest college in the country. It's an impressive place to be. But I had looked at a number of schools, one of which was Valparaiso University in Indiana, so a Lutheran school. And those two sort of made up my college boundaries. Being in New Jersey, I said let me see if I can reverse the map. I'd go as far south as Virginia and as far west as Chicago, and that was sort of my zone that I would look at. Valpo had sent me stuff because of going to a Lutheran church, and it's a Lutheran college. They find you and start sending you materials and doing that. And it was a good place to go take a visit because we had some family that had moved to the Twin Cities a couple of years before, and it was a chance for us to go visit them too as we drove through Indiana to get out there. But it was, at the end of it, I wanted to go to William and Mary. That just seemed really cool, what I wanted to do. They put me on a waiting list, and I looked at the idea of kind of not knowing where I was going to college, waiting, thinking about, what are you going to do, and said, I don't want to do that. Valparaiso seemed really nice. We'll go there. And there probably was a little more thought involved in it, but in hindsight, I'm not really sure if there was a whole lot more thought involved. But, so I wound up going to the church college, and I would say my thought was originally, hey, it's not that big a deal. You have to take 3 religion courses, but you could take history of religion. You could take all of these other courses. It's not bad. You don't have to do a lot of churchy stuff. So you get to college, and you start to find a group of friends, and we'd go to church on Sunday. But a couple of us also found our way to what was a Tuesday evening folk service. So, yeah, I am old enough that it was a folk service back then. There was no praise service or anything like that. There was one guitar, and we kind of sat around, or so. And we'd meet on Tuesday nights, and anywhere in the chapel we could find space at the college. We'd be up in the balcony sometimes, we'd be in other places, and it was just sit around in a circle, somebody had guitar. But it was the start of certain things at church kind of maybe taking on a little more meaning for me. So, as I said, we'd all sit together. It was the first time I'd ever had somebody literally hand you communion and say your name when they give you the communion. The body of Christ for you, Jane. And all of a sudden, it started, things started to take on a little more personal meaning on this. Well, this wasn't just this kind of act we went through every time. Hang on, this is for me kind of thing. So it was kind of a start of me changing and growing in faith a little bit. I also, the other thing I remember was a course I had to take. It was called Jesus and the Gospels. And I'm sure, like most college courses, the professor had a pretty good reputation, but I'm betting it was mostly the timing was right, and it wasn't too early in the morning, and it wasn't on Friday afternoon or something, so it seemed like a good course to take. The idea with Jesus in the Gospels, you got this textbook with 4 columns in it, and each column was one of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and it was just a way of, it's kind of a little database of the New Testament, of the Gospels, and it would take an incident, Jesus going into Jerusalem, and you would just see what was said in each of the 4 Gospels, how it was described. And it was the first time, as you'd see those stories, and as you're in a college thing where you're trying to, you think you're really smart and you're trying to make sense of everything like that, it was like, well, why did Matthew write this, and why did Luke write that? And it was always, why did John write whatever he wrote? Because it didn't seem to tie to the other 3 a lot. But it really started to give an explanation of, well, hang on, Matthew wrote this because he was primarily writing to a Jewish audience, and they wanted to hear this reference to the Old Testament. And Luke said this because he was writing mostly to Greeks, and he was a doctor, and so he described it this way. And it was just another situation where abstract kind of religious things all of a sudden maybe took on a little more meaning. It's like, oh, okay, I kind of get that. But on a personal thing, early in those college years, I wound up being home one break, and I was actually talking to my mom about, hey, I've been doing these courses, we've been listening to this stuff, and it was what I would think of now, even though I was in college, maybe the first time I've ever had a discussion about faith with my mom, for doing that, even though we had been through a ton of stuff. And we talked about things, and she talked about how faith had really gotten her through the time after my dad's dying, and how important that was for her. And, in hindsight, yeah, but at the time I had never really thought about that. I hadn't thought about faith being important. It was always in our lives, but it wasn't something huge. But it was the start of maybe me starting to recognize that some of these choices, some of these decisions, actually maybe had some basis other than just me, flipping a coin and coming up with what I thought was a good decision. So move ahead a little bit. Out of college, I wound up working for an accounting firm in Elkhart, Indiana. And short of being an exit on the interstate, there's not a whole lot in Elkhart, Indiana. It probably was not my most, definitely not another active faith time. But also just not much of an active time. I wound up staying there about a year and a half before it was time for a change. And I had a friend who I knew from college who was in Rockford, Illinois, who said, hey, why don't you come up here? We've got a smaller accounting firm. We're trying to change some things around. And so I said, sure. I wasn't particularly thrilled with where I was at. It was fine, but it wasn't really fulfilling. So I moved to Rockford like a year and a half out of college. And so we were looking for an apartment somewhere that we could split that was reasonably nice. And we found a place that we thought was good, and we moved in. And lo and behold, right out the backyard, if you went out the back door of this kind of townhouses and walked maybe 100 yards across the field, there was Living Christ Lutheran Church in Loves Park, Illinois. So I found myself coming back into church again. Even in your 20s, if the late service is at 11 and it takes you 1 minute to walk there, it's pretty hard to convince yourself you can't go. Yeah. So I started with the church there again and became kind of active again and wound up becoming the youth leader at that point in time. I can remember we didn't have the kind of program we had here. It was still a pretty small church too, and it was much more traditional, I would say. But we wound up doing 2 national youth conventions while I was there, where we drive with the kids. One was in San Antonio and one was in Denver. We made major trips cross country to go there. Boundary Waters trip, carrying canoes and portaging between lakes. A lot of times just spent working with those kids in ways that I didn't think was particularly brilliant. It was a lot of activities. I don't know that I felt we really talked about faith a whole lot, but we would talk about stuff because you're spending time with middle school and high school kids, and they like to talk about stuff. And you'd occasionally have one of the parents come up, I'm sure Ben gets this, have one of the parents come up and say, "Oh, Jimmy talked to me about this thing you said the other week," which usually makes you kind of nervous because you're not exactly sure what that's going to be. But it almost always wound up being, "Yeah, you talked about this situation that happened with your life, and it resonated with them. They thought about something. It led them to something else." And it was a period, again, where being active in church, being involved, really filled part of me, made me feel like I was doing what I should be doing and doing some things like that. And, just one of those other points along this trail that we're going through. Two more little points. One was the baptism of my nephew, Kurt. So my sister's oldest boy, my younger sister's oldest boy, being baptized at this big church in Chicago suburbs. Kind of this monstrous thing. I don't know, there were dozens and dozens of kids being baptized. But there was a small gathering then afterwards out at the house with some family and friends. And so at that gathering, I'm pretty sure the only other person who was not married was Jane. And so that's the place where we actually, even though we'd been at some things together, we both say we met. And there are some weird family myths about some picture of us running across a field with the sunlight or so, but that was not true. That's just family legend as it's grown up over times. But this was another case where the act of doing something, becoming godparent for my child, which has my nephew, which has meaning in and of itself, but this took a shape that would obviously, alter the rest of my life, at this point in time, also in terms of meeting somebody who I wound up marrying, being my partner for life, in both faith life as well as family life. And so, it's just one of these other kind of points in time where all of a sudden I realize maybe faith is entering into this a little bit. Maybe God has some kind of a hand in these things. Even though at the time it's probably safe to say I wasn't thinking that way and doing it. And so I've got one last one, which was a period where we changed churches. So it was when Jane took the position to come here at New Heights. So, obviously I was like, well, I've got to figure out what I'm doing for church. Jane was here and had been here for a while and talked about the people, the church, both buildings at that point in time, and the two congregations coming together. And it's like, well, hey, that sounds fine. I want to support my wife. It sounds like a kind of a cool place. It's not that long a drive. I'll start coming out here also. And, it's again another one of these things where I don't know that I gave it quite a whole lot of thought. I don't know that I was actively listening for any kind of call or direction or anything like that. But it's another choice I made that now in hindsight, I look on a little bit differently. As I was working on the idea of doing a faith story, you think about worshiping here at New Heights and the way we approach things here and the way we think about things here and how that led to me even doing this faith story for doing that at the time. I don't know that I would have thought I really have a story or I have a lot of activities or I have anything that's worth sharing. But, when you come here, you realize we've got a faith community here where people grasp that they have a faith, that God is with them, the Spirit is with them, there are things to share, and we minister to each other. Even this whole period now where we do faith stories with Pastor Rob being on sabbatical. At times I don't know that we appreciate how important it is that we do this, that we lead the life that God is calling us to lead, that we try to be Spirit-led, and that we don't just, as I would have thought with my earlier decisions, hey, I made some pretty good decisions there on occasion. They turned out well. you want to give yourself all the credit as opposed to giving the Spirit credit for some of these things. And I think that's one of the things since being here I've come to better appreciate. That, maybe I'm not quite as smart or as lucky as I thought I was. Maybe, God's playing a hand in this stuff. And being involved in a community that is aware of God's presence, seeks it out, asks for help from it, does various things like that, is willing to share things like family, faith stories, various other things like that, really, is life-changing for people and leads to lives that we lead. So the parallel I've come to think of, or the metaphor, is a car navigation system. So, you're driving along, and all of a sudden there's this little voice, and it's kind of quiet, it's very polite, and it says, make a right turn in 1 mile. And, you're driving along, and, you probably hear it, you think about it, you may or may not even be that aware of it, and your turn in 1 mile comes along, and you may make the right turn. You may think you see something cool up ahead, so you keep driving straight, or you may think, I know a faster way to get there. I'm going to make a left, because that'll really work. Whether it does or not is irrelevant. But I tend to think of now God and the Spirit as kind of that little voice. There's these little suggestions that you should turn. There's these thoughts that this might be a good thing for your life. And we all have the chance to either turn right or not turn right. That's the way our lives are set up. And I don't know that I would have really thought about those kind of things as Spirit-led, faith-led, or so. But, in prepping for this and thinking about things and going through a lot of the stuff you do, being part of a faith community and thinking about how it affects your life, I do realize that these are God giving us choices in our life and suggesting the way that we should go. And I think what I've learned from here is to try to listen for that. We went to church for a lot of years, and I don't know that I ever would have had the thought that that's something you should actively be listening for. God is out there, pay attention. We always figured something would happen, but so I in kind of trying to wrap things up, a lot of times in my life, and what I realized is, I maybe come up with 5 or 6 as I'm working for this, which you realize how much stuff has happened in your life. And if you come up with 5 or 6 things where you think a decision made a big difference, that's just a tiny fraction of how much is really, really out there. But that's how much I've been able so far to kind of recognize that God may be helping lead some of these decisions, and the Spirit may be involved in whether I take the left or take the right, or whether I went to one college or a different college, or whether we moved somewhere that just happened to have a church out the backyard that got me back active in doing things again. So I was looking for a scripture or so to kind of help with this and think with this. And it was good that we'd been doing some psalm things, although it wasn't that it just popped up in a service. But in the Psalm 32, verse 8 says, I will guide you and teach you the way you should go. I will give you good advice and watch over you. And that's when I think of my faith story, what God's been doing for me. He's been that little voice in that car navigation system, occasionally saying things, whether I was even aware of it or whether I wanted to follow the direction or not is irrelevant. If I didn't follow the direction, a little while later, I'd get a new direction, and I'd get a new way. God's kind of that system that recalculates for us. If we choose not to go there, he's going to come up with a different way for us to still get there. And if we don't follow it long enough, we may never get there. But at least persistent, as much as the navigation system is persistent. And so, my thought from this is, as I realize that now, and I think of this community and the way we realize it here, is we're on the right trail as long as we listen for that voice and, some of the time, at least take that right turn when it's offered to us, and God will keep guiding us, directing us, and leading us to where He'd like us to go and where we're better off for ourselves going. So thank you, and if you'll pray with me, that would be great. Dear Lord, thank you for watching over all of us, for giving us direction, for giving us ways that we can lead our lives in a way that's pleasing to you and is obviously pleasing to us. Keep being there for us. Keep offering us alternatives. Keep showing us ways that we can be the people that we're destined to be, that shows your presence, but shows others how we can lead the kind of lives and help others lead the lives that bring them fulfillment, bring them closer to you, and coincidentally, the lives that are more like your Son and the life that He led. So we thank you for all of the opportunities you give us and ask that you continue to help give us direction, whether we're not only in the times where we ask you to do that, but in the times where we don't forget to ask you to do that, or in the times where we sort of say, we don't want you to do that. Please keep guiding our lives and leading us in the directions that we should go in. Amen.